You're listening to the Generation to Generation podcast, episode 26. Persecution of Christians is on the rise worldwide, especially in majority Muslim countries. Churches are bombed or burned, property is confiscated, individual believers are harassed or imprisoned, and in some places even the act of trying to share the gospel is illegal. But where there are obstacles, there are also opportunities. Despite the difficulties of ministering in a country generally hostile to Christians, Andrew Brunson heeded God's call on his life. His story of faithfulness despite threats and persecution is an inspiration to a life of perseverance in the face of difficulty. As always, thanks for listening. Joining us today is missionary and author Andrew Brunson. Andrew and his wife Noreen were involved in starting churches, training believers, aiding refugees, and a house of prayer in Turkey for 23 years, until being falsely accused of terrorism in October of 2016. Turkish police arrested Andrew and Noreen 3 months after a failed coup attempt on the president of the country. In the following weeks and months, the Turkish media reported that Andrew was the mastermind of the July 2016 coup. Government officials and media accused him of plotting with terrorists, and state propaganda said his reward would have been being named the next director of the CIA. Andrew's imprisonment caused Christians around the world to pray for him and his release, which happened in October 2018. In his book, God's Hostage, A True Story of Persecution, Imprisonment, and Perseverance, Andrew shares his story of suffering and God's loving purpose in our lives. He and his wife Noreen currently live in Black Mountain, North Carolina. Andrew, it's great to have you on the podcast.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
Well, Andrew, I've really been looking forward to our conversation today and appreciate you coming on the podcast. I've had the privilege of reading your book as well as listening to several of your talks and sermons over the years. And, I was wondering if you could share with our listeners your first memory of hearing the gospel preached and your heart for missions, even at an early age.
I don't remember when I first heard the gospel preached. I grew up in a missionary home. My parents were missionaries to Mexico at that time, and they went when I was 2 months old. So I grew up in that environment. So from my earliest memories are of my parents doing mission work, and they did something that was a great blessing to me. I see now how much of a blessing it was, that they read the Bible to us 3 times a day. So around each mealtime, they would spend at least half an hour. Old Testament in the morning, New Testament in the afternoon, and at night it was Psalms and Proverbs. So I grew up just in that kind of environment where it was constant reading of the Word and them imparting their values to us. One of my very earliest memories, and it's how I ended up in missions. I'm both of 7 children. None of the others went into missions overseas. So it isn't just continuing the family tradition. When I was 3 years old, I think. Well, here's how it starts. Hudson Taylor, who was a missionary to China, well-known missionary, when he was a very old man, a woman took her 2 sons to him and said, I want you to lay hands on them and set them aside for missions. And so he did that, and both of the boys grew up to become missionaries. And one of them, Stanley Solto is his name. When he was a very old man, shortly before he died, my mother took me and my sister to him and asked that he do for us what Hudson Taylor had done for him. And so he did. He laid hands on us and set us aside for missions the way Hudson Taylor set him aside. And I remember that very well because, well, not very well, but it's one of my very earliest memories because right after that I got a spanking because
I remember that in the book.
Yeah, I hadn't been acting well, and so my mother spanked me, but that kind of printed it in my mind. So I have that as one of my very earliest memories. And from that time, I had a strong sense that I was to be a missionary. And I think what happened is that there was an impartation there that God honored from Hudson Taylor to Stanley Solto, then to me. So even during my teen years, when I was not, not seriously walking with God, uh, if someone were to ask me, what are you going to do when you're older, I would say, if I survive this period of my life, I know I'm supposed to be a missionary. So it was very strongly ingrained in me, just that sense of calling.
Yeah. Andrew, I don't know that I've heard you speak to this. I'm sure you have. Just, as far as maybe your first moment of just feeling that pull in your heart and that love and being drawn towards Turkey and the people of Turkey. I was wondering if you could kind of speak to that call towards Turkey and when that first
Yeah,
started.
yeah. So it did not start with any kind of love or appreciation for Turkey. We were asked by our uh, mission agency, which was a denominational mission, to go to Turkey, and we had been headed toward Egypt. And then
Hmm.
they sprung on us, kind of. It was a surprise, and we really didn't want to go there. But we said, God, if you tell us to continue on to Egypt, then we will do that. Otherwise, we will go with what they're asking us to do. And God never said anything. He
Hmm.
was, and so we went. We went to Turkey. We were not really excited about it. My wife cried on the plane on the way over. Just, this is, my life is over, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so there wasn't any kind of romanticized, idealized view of the Turks. It was more a sense of obedience to what we thought God wanted us to do. Now, during the first years there, God, well, I mean, we could only go up because we didn't have high expectations. Turkey is the largest unevangelized country in the world. We knew that it would be a difficult field. But in the first few years, God put some of His love. That's the way we think of it. That He put some of His love for Turkey into our hearts, and it
Yeah.
wasn't again this romanticized idea of uh, just loving the culture, being enamored of its food and ways. It was much more a love that expresses itself in a commitment to see blessing come to see the kingdom of God come there.
Yeah.
And we became very deeply committed to seeing that happen in Turkey.
Yeah, and I guess one of the things you talk about in the book is just even just some of the work that you and Noreen were doing, and just the missionaries in Turkey. I was wondering if you could speak to just some of that early work as far as helping refugees, and then not potentially came later, but just some of that early work as you and Noreen entered into Turkey.
Sure, I want to add something to the previous thought. Is that
Yeah.
we uh, we have no regrets at having gone to Turkey. So it started out, we didn't have high expectations, but we became so persuaded that God wanted us to be there and had assignments for us there that helped us through a number of difficulties, believing that this is what God had for us. And we are so happy that we did go there in spite of the difficulties that we experienced, especially the final 2 years of our time in Turkey. And we have no regrets about having gone there. So the majority of our ministry time was spent in church planting. We were involved in several church plants in several different cities. Most Turkish cities do not have even a single church. So it's the largest evangelized country in the world. Most Turks have never met a born-again Christian. And I think there's like one out of every 16,000 Turks has professed faith in Jesus. So it's a very small group. And so we were involved in starting churches, worked in several church plants with teammates, and started a house of prayer and did some training programs. And then when the war in Syria heated up, many Syrians just came over, flooded over the border into Turkey. They also went into other countries in the area, but many of them came into Turkey. And the way we saw this, uh, God had spoken to me in 2009 and had it really surprised me, but he said, prepare for harvest. And when I first heard that, I thought, no, I think you're wrong. This is a mistake, God. Because as I look at the history of missions, usually there have been decades of sowing, of faithful sowing with very little response, and then a move of God starts. But there's been a lot of preparation. So I thought of Turkey, largest unevangelized country in the world. Very little evangelism has been done there, and so I thought that Noreen and I would work there faithfully for years, and then our children or our grandchildren would see the results of that and fruit in the future. And so to hear, no, prepare for our harvest now really surprised me. And I came to see that God intends to circuit the process, to just speed it up, accelerate it in a way that usually has not happened in the past. And so when Syrians started to flood into the country, we saw this as, okay, we need to prepare for harvest among them as well, because Syria is an unreached country. Its missionaries couldn't really be there. And so it was inaccessible to the gospel in many ways. And here, many of them coming into our area, and we could go and help them in their time of need, but also give them the gospel. And so we wanted to see a number of Syrians become believers and then go back to Syria and be the foundation of churches there. So we saw this as a real opportunity to reach inaccessible people. And so we started work among them. There was a high degree of response relative to what we saw in Turkey in the past. And I think this was because of the trauma that many of them had gone through. The foundations of all of the things that they had trusted in had been shaken and torn down. And they were that made them willing to ask questions that they never would have entertained in the past. So out of that, a refugee church started, and a number did go back into Syria, and the church started there as well.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the things that just, as you write in the book, you talk about just that work that's taking place, not only in Turkey, but just like with the refugees from Syria. And then you go in right in detail in your book about you and Noreen's arrest. You talk about those last 2 years in your time in Turkey and how Noreen was released after several weeks. And, you share in your experiences that there, I've heard you speak to this, that really there are two stories to what happened to you both, that there's the side of the earthly political forces that were at work, and ultimately there's the story of God's plan and story of redemption and the kingdom, moving forward. In one sense, the shaking that allowed for people to be open to the gospel and ask those kind of questions. And I know in the book you talk about how you were labeled at that time of your arrest a G82, which is a threat to Turkish national security, and were referred to as...
Well, that was the least of things. That was at the beginning of our arrest and into the first few months. They were just trying to throw various accusations at me, and they would change their mind about what they were accusing me of, and they tried to make something stick. So the G82, basically, threat to national security is just a label, and then they deport. But then they got a lot more serious than that, and over time, and eventually, the things they accused me of carried mandatory 3-life sentences in solitary confinement with no possibility of parole. So it became very serious.
Yeah, and I think with that, I was kind of just wondering, if you could share with our listeners your thoughts, looking back on, why the authorities in Turkey had you arrested in the fall of 2016.
Yeah, so this goes to the human story and the God story. And the God story tends to be less visible, but I think it is the underlying fundamental storyline. So the human side of it would be that they arrested us to deport us, and I think they were going to deport us, which would usually happen within 1 or 2 days maximum for an American. But someone decided to keep us, and I think, and they kept us for 13 days together. Then Noreen was released, and then they extended mine for another 2 years. And so the reason they initially kept us, I think, was to intimidate other missionaries and have them, because of fear or a higher cost possibility to them staying, that they would self-deport, leave on their own. And then it extends some more, and I think they also wanted to intimidate the local Turkish believers and the local Turkish leaders. The idea being, the message being, if we can do this to an American, we can do this to anybody. And it was a very intimidating thing. Now, after time, they also began to leverage me to try to gain concessions from the U.S. government, and it became more of a political pawn. But the entire time, there was a spiritual story going behind this, and that's the God story, that even with all the political intrigue, the media propaganda campaign led by the government, all these different things that were happening, that God was leveraging this himself. I think of him as a grandmaster chess player who was using my imprisonment, what was intended to harm me, and he was turning it upside down in a very subtle way at the beginning, in a hidden way, because millions of people began to pray for me around the world. This was an unprecedented prayer movement focused on one person. So it didn't just grow my wife putting out prayer requests. God initiated, he drove this and sustained a long-term widespread prayer movement that was intended to bless me, to sustain me in prison. But he was also using me as a magnet to pull all of that prayer into Turkey. Remember in 2009, I said he had spoken to me, he said, prepare for harvest. And here in 2016, I'm arrested at Extents for 2 years. And I begin to see, as we hear about this prayer movement, that my imprisonment is serving this assignment to prepare for harvest. And God is using me to prepare the harvest much more in prison than if I were outside of prison, because he was using me as that magnet to draw in the prayer that really is preparing the people there for the great move that's coming.
I mean, it really ties in to this. I mean, this next question where, you're talking about just the power of prayer. And, I've heard you speak, about just the dark inheritance in Turkey from the Ottoman Empire and just the historic oppression of Christianity over the years. And in many ways, Turkey being the spiritual key to the region. And a huge theme in your story is the power of prayer and just what you said in 2009, the Lord saying to you, prepare for harvest. And, I remember, serving as an associate pastor in the fall of 2016 and, being at a Thursday morning prayer breakfast with a handful of older men. I want to say there was 6 men at Dixie Diner eating bacon and biscuits in a small town in western North Carolina that I think you're familiar with, of about 14,000 people. When I first heard your name, mentioned by a man named Howard George, who had mentioned of your arrest, and just from that day for the next 2 years, at every prayer breakfast, these men in this small town, just praying for you, Noreen, the kids, but also, as you were saying, praying for the people of Turkey. And, you just spoke to it a little bit, but I was just wondering, Andrew, like as a pastor, a missionary, and someone who loves those who bear God's image, just that you could speak to that unprecedented worldwide prayer movement that took place.
Yeah, so I want to add to what I said, because I went off on the same track. The God story was really underlying all of this. And people don't see it as much because they see the political intrigue and all the things that were going on. But God was, so whatever the Turkish government thought they were doing and the reasons that they had for doing it, behind it, God was really moving things. And there were a number of times when I should have been released. I think the U.S. government was surprised as it went on and on and on. and the Turks had to release him here. They would make deals and then back out. And I think that God was extending my imprisonment to build this prayer movement. And one of the there were a couple of times when it was very close, when I could have gotten out, and actually when I think God had shown that this was a real possibility. And what happened is that we didn't really know what we were doing, but the focus of my imprisonment in my disciplines and in spiritual disciplines was to come to a point of surrender to God's will. And I think Jesus saying, in the Garden of Gethsemane, not my will, but your will be done. And I would say, God, I don't want your will to be done with this if it means staying in prison.
Yeah.
I just could not handle the idea because, people think, oh, Andrew, you were there in prison 2 years. I said, yes, I will, but I didn't know it would be 2 years because they wanted to give me life in prison. And so until the day that I got out, until the day I actually left Turkey, I did not know that I was out. And so it was living with that uncertainty under that heavy weight of basically life in prison. And so I had to fight. It became my daily battle to fight through to a point where I could say, God, if your purposes are best served by my being in prison, my purposes are best served by my getting out. I want to be with my family, but I want to put your priorities ahead of mine. And so if it serves your purposes for me to be in prison, then give me the strength to persevere so that I can be faithful to you. And that became a daily battle, fighting through, starting in the morning with fear and discouragement, and just fighting through that point of surrender, having a measure of peace in that, and then the next morning starting over with the same battle. As I did that, I think God extended my imprisonment. And I think what he was, I don't have time to go into it. You read the book, so you know a couple of those situations. And I can go into detail now because of time, but I think essentially what God was saying was, I could release you now, but if you're willing to surrender this, then I will do something greater.
Yeah.
And now, if he'd said it that clearly, it would have been very helpful to me. But whatever guidance he gives us, he always leaves room for faith, so that you cannot, you still have to keep moving in trust and faith. And so I didn't quite know what I was doing in surrendering, what it meant, the extension of time, but he used that. And you already mentioned it in your preface to this, but he used my imprisonment to raise up this huge number of people around the world. There were millions of peace praying, for example, for me in Turkey. And I thought at the time, why? This is embarrassing. I'm not worthy of this. Why would the Chinese, who have so many of their own prisoners for the Lord, why would they pray for me? I appreciate it. I so value it, but I feel so unworthy. And I realized that God was turning, putting me on people's hearts and turning them toward Turkey, because it is a key to the region. And when the move of God comes, I believe in my lifetime that millions of Turks are going to turn to Jesus. And that when that happens, that all of the areas that they influence in the name of Islam, that there will be a greater freedom in some way for the gospel, and that that the gospel will spread throughout the Ottoman Empire in a more powerful way. Now, that does not mean it's going to be easy, and I think the move of God often happens in difficult times. And even as God showed us what a harvest would begin to look like, he showed us also that it would happen in difficulty.
Yeah, and I think to that, Andrew, and that's one of the things that's a theme also in your book, and just the daily battle and just the purpose and suffering and things not being easy. And one of the things that I'm so thankful for in your story is how God is continuing to use your honesty, and just the lesson of Isaiah 50:10 that says, let him who walks in darkness and has no light trust in the name of the Lord and lean on his God. And this is also a quote from Bonhoeffer that I always love to, I would say, preach and teach about. And my wife and I talk about this, that it's easy to preach and teach about this quote. It's another thing as a follower of Christ, even in our own lives, myself included, when we're walking through those difficult times, where Bonhoeffer talks about, from its very beginning, the church has taken offense at the suffering of Christ. It does not want that kind of Lord. And as Christ's church, it does not want to be forced to accept the law of suffering from its Lord. The cross is not the terrible end of a pious, happy life. Instead, it stands as the beginning of community with Jesus Christ. Whenever Christ calls us, his call leads us to death. And that's one of those things, just the difficulty of that for all of us as followers of Christ. And, you talk about in the book, being unprepared, for the suffering that you walk through. I was wondering if you could maybe speak to that, and maybe unpack what that was like for you, just having this, I know like for you and for me growing up in the church, we have these, stories of brothers and sisters in the faith, in the midst of suffering, and just the reality of when that hits, just that it can be very different than maybe the idealized version that we have in our hearts and our minds.
Yeah, so I had counted the cost my wife and I both had for certain things. We knew that there was risk. We'd had bomb threats, death threats. I was attacked by a gunman. There were risks when we worked on the Syrian-Turkish border near war zones. So, these were things that we counted the cost. I don't know if we did so naively, but we had counted the cost and were prepared for certain risks. We did not count the cost of prison because no one had been put in prison in Turkey for their faith before I was, and at least in recent memory. And so one of the things that was very difficult was my expectations when I was in prison were that and this came partly from reading biographies and testimonies, is that I would feel joy and strength and have a real sense of grace, and especially have a sense of God's presence. And this was especially important to me because I had been running after God's presence in the sense of wanting to experience deep intimacy with him and be very close to his heart and to have a sense of his presence in my daily life. I'd done that for years and I had experienced that. And so when this was removed from me in prison, the reality is I didn't feel joy and didn't feel strength, and I did not feel a sense of God's presence or a sense of grace. And this surprised me. I had grace, but it was an unfelt grace. And this really surprised me because I thought, this is, my darkest time. I'm failing. I am breaking here. And I'm doing this because I'm suffering for you, Jesus. It's for you. It's because of you that I'm undergoing these things. So I was the only Christian, and all of my cellmates were very committed Muslims who were very intensely involved in praying and chanting the Quran all day long and all night as well. So the environment was very difficult for me. There was also uncertainty. As I mentioned, I didn't know what the Turkish government was going to do with me, but it was clear they had very dark intentions. I was cut off from all other Christians, from my wife, in a very intense environment in a high security prison. And so I had a lot of fear. The fear and the uncertainty led to just constant adrenaline and a buildup of adrenaline and cortisol in my system. So I wasn't sleeping. So the sleep deprivation, the isolation, and I had before that I'd been in solitary confinement for 50 days, which was also very difficult. And that's how they break people. They isolate you and sleep deprive. So I started to break down. I also had a number of doubts and questions in my mind, having a very difficult time in my relationship with God because I felt very disappointed. I felt abandoned by Him and almost betrayed by Him. So I'm just being very open with the emotions I had. And there were a couple other things. One is I was afraid that I was losing my mind, that I was starting to cross over to the border of insanity sometimes. I tasted that. And the other was the fear that I would eventually, because of all of these factors put together, I'm breaking down physically, I lose 50 pounds. Emotionally, I'm a wreck. I'm isolated. There's no Christian with me to pray with me, correct me, encourage me. And my cellmates kept telling me, Andrew, you will become a Muslim. And I certainly did not want to become a Muslim. And at no point did I want to abandon my faith in the Lord. But I feared, is it possible that over time, with all of these doubts and the silence of God, the isolation, that I will just tip over, slide away from God and end up falling away from Him. And I remember the words of Jesus, where He says, if your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out. Better to go into heaven with one eye than to go into hell with two eyes. And I was not thinking very clearly, but this, I said, wouldn't it be better if I commit suicide, if I kill myself? And yes, it would be a defeat on my part to do that. And that's not what you want from me, God. But wouldn't it be better for me to do that and just go to heaven and be with you than to stay alive, avoid that defeat, but then end up sliding away from you? And so in my twisted way of thinking, with all the other factors and pressures on me, I was seriously considering suicide. And I think the issue is I didn't want to die, but I couldn't imagine living with the pressure that I was. It was overwhelming. And I think the combination of despair and of panic is very, very dangerous.
Yeah.
I just wanted to escape the situation I was in. And I struggled with suicide off and on with desiring it and wanting it over a period of months.
I think that's, Andrew, just what really struck me, and my wife, made this comment as well as she read the book, is just the constant disruption and isolation, and being moved from Iskent to Harmondali to Sakran to Buka, and just the constant disruption to the rhythm, and just and not knowing, and just that devastating impact that isolation can have on human beings. And just wondering if you could kind of speak to those who are listening, that while very different in many ways from your experiences, what would you want those who are listening, who have been isolated from family, friends, in this time of social distancing, just for them to be mindful of, as far as even for pastors? You talk about that kind of crushing weight that I think for many times for pastors and leaders, that they struggle in silence. And if you could just kind of maybe speak to maybe the pastor or the parent who is listening, who maybe is considering kind of taking their own life, that what you would say to them.
Yeah, so I've talked about the very deep, dark valleys, you could say. There were times of intense testing, but that's only part of the story, because especially during the second half of my imprisonment, I went through a rebuilding process. That rebuilding process, God brought a lot of healing into my life, but it also it was something where I was partnering with Him. I was, what I would say, cooperating with grace. And to get to that point, I had to take a number of steps. I had to cooperate with Him. I had to. One of the things I did was move away from. My emotions during this whole time were always in turmoil and negative, and there was reason for that. because my situation looked pretty bleak. But I made a decision that they were decisions of the will. And this is what I emphasize. It wasn't because I felt good or wanted to do things. I determined that I had to do things, that I had to turn myself toward God, that I had to fight for my relationship with Him. And so those were decisions of the will to turn myself toward Him in difficulty. And I think that is something I would emphasize to people, is that whatever your situation is, however difficult it is, you always have a choice whether you're going to turn toward or away from God. What is the inclination of the heart going to be? And a number of that was the turning point for me when I was transferred to maximum security prison, and that led me to reevaluate where I was. And I came to the realization that there was very little I could do to fight for my freedom, but that I could fight for my spiritual life, for my walk with God, and that I desperately needed to, because my friendship with Him had been significantly eroded. Mm-hmm. And so I made the decision, whatever you do or don't do, I will follow you, whether you speak to me or not, whether you deliver me or not, whether you give me a sense of your presence or not. I determined that I will strive to be faithful to you. And so that was a turning point, a decision. I will turn my face toward you. And I saw myself as a sunflower. A sunflower follows the sun throughout the day. It turns, as the sun moves across the sky, it turns to follow it. And I said, I want to do this, God. I want to follow you. I want my eyes to be focused on you throughout the day, again and again and again, returning to you. And I very intensely began to run after Him. You mentioned before Isaiah 50:10. It became my theme verse. You could say, God says, for the one who walks in darkness and has no light, trust in the name of your God and lean on Him. And He could have easily said, wait, you're in darkness. Here, let me give you some light. That's what we want. Yeah. He does often do that. Yeah. But He didn't. He didn't say, I'll give you light. He said, basically, you're in darkness. You're going to be there for a while. Lean on me. Yeah. And I had to learn to lean into God, even if I didn't feel His presence, even if I didn't have His voice, whatever my feelings were, and just make that decision. I will lean into you.
And Andrew, I've just even as you speak to that, as far as making that choice to lean on the Lord, in the midst of darkness, in the midst of suffering, I've heard you.
Can I say something here? You triggered something in my mind. Is that many people have said to me, "Oh, Andrew, you were just trusting God. You just really learned to trust in God." And I said, "No, that I don't think that's the right word. I would say I didn't really understand trust. I still do not have a real grasp of trust." Because usually, trust is a wide spectrum kind of thing. We trust in different levels in different ways. But I would say that I didn't have a lot of trust. And because in the sense, people usually, when they say trust, they're really trusting for an outcome. Like someone would say to my wife, who does not like to fly, but does anyway, they'd say, we're just trust in God. What does that mean? What they're really saying is, well, get on that airplane and trust in God, because the plane won't go down. But nowhere in the Bible does it say that your plane isn't going to crash. So, but really what they're saying is trust in God and there's going to be a good outcome. It's outcome oriented. And usually when people would send me a message in prison, and in the second year I was able to receive letters. The first year I was not. In the second year, someone would say, just trust in God. And what they're meaning by that is eventually you're going to get out. He's going to save you. It was a matter of devoting to God, determining I would be faithful. And the words that I would use now instead of trust since trust is so related to outcome in our minds and in our hearts, is leaning into the leadership of Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
That I say, I don't know what you're going to do, Jesus. I've come to think that God is much less predictable than I thought.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean he is faithful, he is true, but I really don't know what he's going to do in many situations. And what leaning into his leadership has come to mean to me is, I don't know what you're going to do. I don't know if you're going to intervene in my situation or how you will intervene or what the outcome will be, but I trust in your leadership that you are going to shape me and mold me and bring me into your kingdom. Because that's really what I'm focused on now is, Paul had said something in 2 Timothy. 2 Timothy became my favorite book in prison, because it's Paul's last writing after he's in a dungeon and he knows he's going to be executed. And that at the end of it, he still says that Jesus is going to save me from all harm, from all evil. He will carry me through. This is while he's facing execution. So clearly, he doesn't mean that Jesus will keep him from execution. It means he will carry him through to the end, to be in his presence, to heaven, to eternal life. And so this is now what I'm trying to do is, in uncertainty, is just lean into him. I have also, during this COVID crisis, think, okay, am I going to die?
Yeah. Yeah.
And there's no guarantee, right? And so I say, okay, I lean into your leadership. Whatever you allow to happen, I'm just leaning into you.
Yeah, and I think just even to what you're saying, Andrew, it's just convicting, because I just know it's so easy for me to default in my own heart to just kind of that outcome orientation, and how that's connected to suffering. We were talking about earlier, where it's easier to kind of preach or speak or teach or even counsel about suffering, but is that relationship with trust, connected to, well, I'm trusting that the plane is not going to crash, and that's not promised for us. And in Matthew 5, we see where Jesus says, blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. And you talk about a lot just kind of preparing the next generation for what's coming, and the need for the American church just to have this understanding of the persecution that's on the way. And so I was wondering if you could kind of speak to that, just that position a lot in the West towards outcome, and just how, in one sense, we've been blessed since World War II with so much affluence, economically, but how that maybe has impacted our hearts, maybe to really default a lot towards outcome orientation, and so I guess what I'm asking is, what would you say as far as the mindset and the mentality that we need to grow as followers of Christ in the American church?
So we became aware as we went along that when it comes to persecution, there is no guaranteed outcome. You cannot know what is going to result from it. Jesus told his followers that they would be persecuted. He doesn't say that he'll save them from that persecution. And so there are no guarantees when it comes to persecution. As I said, there was no verse that I could find that said I would for sure get out of prison. I had hoped for it, but there was no guarantee. Now, my concern, especially in the States, is that if we do not have the possibility of persecution as part of our worldview, as an expectation, and the Bible does say anyone who wants to live a godly life will be persecuted. It's not just people over in Muslim countries. This is anybody who wants to live a godly life will face some degree of persecution. And I think that it's becoming increasingly, the environment in the States is becoming increasingly hostile toward people who stand clearly for Jesus, not only in saying, I belong to Jesus and I'm a Christian, but those who will identify with his teaching. And this is very important, with the things that he stands for, with standards of holiness and morality that he teaches. And so the environment is becoming very hostile. The political media and business classes increasingly are hostile to people of faith. And so there's going to be an increasing price for standing for the Lord. And if we have as an expectation that this can happen to us, and then we begin to prepare our hearts. If we do not have it, then when pushback comes, we're not ready for it. It shocks us. We become fearful, and the automatic response when we're fearful is to run away, to make the problem go away, to compromise to the degree where people are no longer going to be hostile toward me. And I know a lot about fear because I was very fearful. And I would have run away if I could. I couldn't because I was locked away. It took me about a year to come to the point where I could consistently say, God, I'm willing to remain behind bars if this is what you want for me. And so my concern is that many people in the States are not ready for this. They don't expect it. And when it comes, it's going to surprise them. And they will have fear. And it's normal to have fear. But the issue is, am I going to stand firm when I'm afraid, or am I going to run away? And if we're not ready, we also are more likely to be deceived. These are things that Jesus warned us about, because we will look for teachers who will justify our compromise. They will justify our not standing for the Lord or giving in to the compromises that people demand from us. And I think we already see that happening in the church. And another thing is that we will be offended at what God allows. And offense is it's a very dangerous thing when we become offended at God. God, why are you allowing this? God, why aren't you defending me? God, where are you in my problems? And then we begin to, what I did is, this offense began to suffocate my relationship with God. And it is only after I cut that offense off, and what I did was took my questions and doubts and my offense, and I visualized a lockbox, and I put them in that box, and I locked it, and I said, God, you and I are the only ones who can open it. If you want to open this box and deal with my doubts, questions, and offense while I'm in prison, go ahead. But for myself, I make the decision that I will not open this box. I will not entertain these doubts, these questions, this offense. I will not give it a place in my heart or in my mind again. And the important thing is, I said, I do not need to have answers to have a relationship with you. And so I gave up my demands. And this loosened me from that suffocation that I was going through, and brought me to a position where I could begin to that rebuilding process with God. So my concern is, for this generation now, as hostility increases, are we going to be willing to stand for the Lord? And I think there are two things especially. One is focusing on intimacy with God, because a lover is willing to suffer for the one he loves. And it's because of my love for God that I was willing to undergo suffering for him and not give in. And the other is, I would say, a focus on heaven, a focus on eternity, fear of God. And do I care more about what God says about me, or more about what the Twitter mob says about me? We have a cancel culture, is what they call it. Am I more concerned about being canceled by this culture, which does have repercussions? Or am I more concerned about being canceled by God? because you can be canceled by God, and that is much more serious. And when we begin to have a right perspective, oh, I'll still be afraid, but I'm going to fear God more. And it is this combination of love for God, devotion to Him, and fear of God that fuels endurance and persecution, makes us willing to persevere in persecution.
Andrew, I'm just so thankful just for this conversation, and just could continue for a long time. I just know you have a new grandson, so I want to be respectful of your time, but just so thankful just for just the Lord's faithfulness to you and just the choices you've made and just even what you've shared, which was just so encouraging. Just the reality that, a lover will endure more than a servant. And so just, thank you for just the choices that you made and, your love for those who bear God's image. And, I was just wondering if you could close our conversation today in prayer.
Yes. So, Father God, I ask that you bring in all of the listeners today, that you bring them into encounter with you, into a deeper intimacy with you. Give them the gift of hunger for your presence. Give them the gift of thirst for your presence, so that they will run after you, become lovers of you. May our hearts be devoted to you. May we make the one thing, which is to sit at your feet and love you with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength. Father God, I ask for the listeners today, for your sons and daughters, that you pour into them the courage, the strength, the determination, the confidence, the endurance, perseverance, and steadfastness of Jesus, that they may run the race set before them and finish well, that they may be faithful in the fires of obedience. And in times of difficulty, may they be faithful to you and be purified in those fires, and may they emerge worthy of you. In Jesus' name I bless them. Amen.
Thanks for listening to today's episode. If you've been enjoying the podcast, I'd really appreciate it if you would leave a review on iTunes or Facebook. If you know someone who might enjoy or be encouraged by the show, feel free to share the podcast with them. Your willingness to share the show is one of the best ways to help it grow. As always, thanks for listening. Until next time.